Cool, friends, welcome. It is week one still, lecture 3. Are you guys able to see my week 1, lecture 3? Perfect, cool. February 9th, got a little bit of housekeeping. You've got discussion questions that are due Sunday at 11:59 p.m. PST. Just so you know, I will literally let you know every day, Monday through Friday, that you've got discussion questions due. So please make sure you go and you get those done. That way I can sleep at night, because that is literally one of the hardest things, is when a student works really hard and does all their assignments and crushes their exam and have to do a retake because they didn't do the discussion questions. So please don't let that be you. I can't do anything about it. That's the other. I would probably let it slide. Be like, yeah, whatever. But I can't do anything about it. So please make sure you do those. You've got 3 core assignments: predict destructuring, convert to arrow. We've talked about destructuring and arrow functions. We're gonna talk a little. I mean, we're gonna use both today, and then you have prop it up, and that's what we're gonna talk about today is props. We're gonna deal with components. We're gonna talk about props, how the prop structure works, how data flows within React. So that is what we're gonna do. Before we get started, usually by the end of the week, I like to do a little bit of a health check. So if in the chat you guys can put, just from a scale of 1 to 5, how are you doing this week? How are you doing on the assignments? How are you feeling about this language? How are you feeling about this class? Cool. 4s, good. 6, yep, we love that. Cool. And also I do this just because, again, I want you guys to, if you are feeling and you don't feel comfortable, if you're feeling like a 2, please put that in, like do a DM to myself or Gray, because that just lets us know and we'll reach out to you and say, hey, is there anything we can do to help you? Because that's literally what I get paid to do. And that's what Gray gets paid to do, is help you, right? So we want to make sure that we are giving you the most, the best experience that you possibly can. So wonderful. Thanks for that, guys. And then also, if you are struggling, it's okay. Other people struggle. This is all new, especially if this is your first stack. This is kind of a lot. And so I also just want to know, we talked a little bit about it post class yesterday, but if you can, if there's anything that I can do to help you learn better, again, if it's captions, if it's slowing down, if I'm going a little too fast, please direct message me right now, and sort of, or you can direct message me on Discord. Just don't, what I would encourage is, and what I hope is, don't get to like week 4 or 5 and think, oh man, if I would have just spoken up, because I love to tailor my lectures. I love to tailor everything I do to make sure that everybody has the ability to learn and everybody's empowered to learn. So if there's anything I can be doing as an instructor, again, if it's slowing down, if it's, I try not to go on too many tangents, but if things are a little bit too high level and you're getting confused, kind of let me know that. Give me that feedback, because I want to become a better instructor and to help you learn in the way that's most optimal for you. So please feel free to DM there. Great. Any questions on housekeeping before we move forward?
Same here. If anyone has questions, please feel free to reach out. I think a couple of students asked for a possible bonus office hour. I can do that. Just let me know. I work Sunday to Thursday specifically. So if you guys are weekend crew people, let's say, hey, let's have a Sunday, office hour. Let me know. I have no problem. So my grades hour is going to start next week. I start to have more planned material, but please reach out, and then how I can assist those who are watching this video. Please reach out. I'm your TA Gray. I'm on the dojo on Discord. I'm Justina Gray, but the same thing either way. But reach out.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Gray. Cool. Well, one thing I wanted to talk about, we talked about this in office hour, just really quickly hitting on backticks in JavaScript. If I've got something like, if I've got a, let's say, let first name equal John, and then I want to say console.log, instead of just doing first name, let's say I wanted to do like, hello, John. Well, what I have to do is I have to use these things called backticks. And what these backticks are is they're right above your tab key on your left side. And it's just right, there's like a little little squiggly, it's called a tilde, I believe. A little squiggly vertical or horizontal line. And then there's just like, it looks like an apostrophe. But by doing these backticks, it actually allows me to inject this variable into a string and call it immediately. If you know anything about Python, it's similar to like an F string. But I know that there's some confusion because if you don't catch that and you just put an apostrophe, it will not work. It'll just think that you are just saying, hello, first name. So you got to make sure that these are backticks if you want to call a variable, not really in part of our assignments, but I just showed that yesterday and it caused a little bit of confusion. And then you also do have to do a $sign. And this is just in JavaScript. You have to do a $sign and then the curly brackets around your variable. Just wanted to hit on that. I know that caused, again, a little bit of confusion yesterday. So wanted to state that. Any questions on that? Cool. We just thought we would do a little bit of a recap. Today's not as heavy, but we're really just going to talk about components and props. But I want to do a little bit of a recap. Can anybody in the chat, or you can come off of chat, anybody tell me what, if I wanted to create a React app, I've already done it because it takes so long. I didn't want to waste your time. Anybody, if I want to create a React app, what would I put into my terminal? Anybody remember? NPX, and then what else after NPX? Great catch. It is NPX, not NPM. Well, it's okay, Jonathan. You got the first half. You got the important part. There we go. So you guys were all, I love that everybody gave a couple portions. Thank you. Then you guys came in after to help. So yes, it is NPX create-react-app and then your app name. So whenever we run that, that gets us this thing right here, this React app. Now we talked about this in office hours. So if you weren't there, then you can also look too. If you're getting an error whenever you're trying to do npm start, if you're getting an error, what will happen is it often is because you have to, after you create your React app, you have to CD into your React app, right? You have to CD into the app that you just created, then you can run npm start. If you try to do it on, you say create React app, and the next thing you say is npm start, what that's going to do is it's going to try to look for a package.json file. Again, we talked about this in the office hours, so that's why I'm not trying to replicate it now. It's going to look for that at the current location, and it's not going to exist because it exists in your app. So you got to go one more step inside, and then you can actually run your app. Now, again, I wanted to talk about, I did create a React app here, right? And we went through this yesterday, so I'm not going to waste your time on re-going through this. But I did just want to hit one more thing on this, is remembering that right here, when we've got this source and we have this app.js. Now I have deleted everything, but this isn't how it sort of comes. But remember that we were able to see that there's this class name, and then in this app, I have app here, and it refers to it. Now this, though it looks like HTML, is what we call JSX, right? And can anybody remember what transpiler we use to convert JSX to HTML? Can anybody remember the name of that? Yeah, exactly. Babel, right? Also, I said it right here. So if you guys were paying attention, great job. So Babel will do that, and it will convert it to JavaScript for our browser to run. One big thing, not big thing, but one thing I just really wanted to note, because I didn't mention it yesterday, is it, for all intents and purposes, operates the exact same way as HTML when we're building things. The only thing is when you do class, instead of doing class to put a class, you have to put class name. That's the only difference for sort of right now for the start. So if you're wanting to deal with or add a class to some of your JSX, then what you'll have to do is class name instead of class, and that will then apply that. That's the big difference between that there. Any questions on that? Cool. Oh, you guys are feeling. Somebody asked, Don't you also have to do HTML4? Nope, not. For right now, you can just leave it just like this. Cool. And that's all you would have to change if you're creating a class, just add the class name. Cool. So let's keep jumping in. We've talked about the Lego concept, and I wanted to talk again a little bit more about the component-based development, which is what we're doing. That's what we're going to be building today. And just again, going through that is we want to make sure that we are building components. And if you guys remember anything about Web Fund, whether you just came from there, then you might remember this a lot. And if you didn't, this might be a little bit of a different concept for you, but we have this idea behind the Lego concept, and we're going to have all these different pieces. Maybe we have a nav bar. We're going to have, you know, our friend list, and then we're going to have the kind of area you could write a message. Let's say that this is Facebook, and then you're going to have all of what your friends are posting, right? And these are all components. These are all different pieces. And if I wanted to change, let's go even a little bit more granular. These are the individual posts that we have. So, oh, that doesn't look good. Sorry. Like that's too dark. Let's say we wanted to do the individual posts. They might look like this, right? You got one post, got another post, got another post, and another one. And the whole power behind component based is we can interchange and move these in and out, right? I can move these in and out, and I can change if I want it. You know, these posts are not going to stay the same. People are posting, people are changing, people are constantly, you know, adding different things and adding comments to it. So again, the power of component based development is we don't have to redo everything and bring in our nav bar and bring in our friends list again. We can just swap these out, right? Let's say I had a post right here. I can just swap it out, or I have a new post. I can just add it in. And that is really, really, really powerful, because what we have to do and what we can do is, instead of creating an individual sort of identifier or individual piece for each of these posts, all I have to do is create one function or component, which is a function, right? I have to create one of them. And then what that will do is it will, I can interchange the data as much as I want, right? I can change it in and out if somebody says this and who said it and everything that somebody, you know, what doesn't matter. I can change the data. I just need to swap out what component is what, right? I can swap out who said what, I can swap out what they said, who commented, everything like that. And I have the framework of how it's supposed to look. And that's really the big power here. Let me clear this. So me, that's a great question. And that kind of leads into our components, right? Because what this also allows is for dry code. Instead of me having to constantly repeat myself, remember dry stands for don't repeat yourself. Instead of me having to redo, okay, this is what a comment looks like. Okay, this is what a comment looks like. Okay, this is what a comment looks like. I actually just have to build one component, I switch out the data, and it all looks the same. I build it one time, switch the data, and that is much, much easier. Now, before we get started on the components, I do want to bring up, there is a, it's called ES7. Yeah. One that I would, no, not that one, this guy. One that I would encourage you guys to download if you're using VS Code, that is called ES7 Plus, React Redux, React Native snippets. These are just little snippets. They're going to help you. I'll show you what they look, you know, one of the snippet pieces today. But this will just help you just be quicker and more efficient if you want it. Cool. Any questions before I dive into actually, let's start building components and understanding components? Any questions? Somebody asked, so do all components created go into app.js? Nope, but I'll show you exactly what that does here in a second. Yeah, cool. Okay, just put a 1 in the chat if all that made sense. Put a 0 if it does not. Yeah, somebody asked if I could show the extension again. Of course. It's just called ES7 plus React Redux. and React Native snippets. What's kind of cool is if you guys learn React, React Native is it's like a spinoff of it, if you will, but it allows you to build mobile development applications. And one of the powerful things with it is what you used to have to do is write like an Android app, and you'd have to have somebody write in Swift, which is iOS. And then now there's different ones like Flutter and React Native that you just build it one time and you can say, this is for Android, this is for Apple. And then it does that, which is pretty sweet. So now you can build mobile applications as well. Cool. So now getting into React components, I want to talk a little bit about the foundation of our app.js, and then we'll build our first component. So one thing to note is that whenever we have a component, in this case is our app.js, but we're going to create our own components. This is our app component. Remember that that's being injected right here. And then it is being shown on our HTML. But it is really important to note that when you are returning something, you can only return one parent element. In this case, this is the div, right? If I were to have something like an H1 and say, hello world, and then I were to have another one, says from Will, cool, this will work, this is fine. Let me actually get in here and I can. And then I want, so this is where I created my React app. Now I look into it. Cool, I've got this. I'm going to CD into React app. Now I'm going to say npm start. Just going to throw that out. Give me just a second. I'll move it over from my other screen. Ooh, I've got an error. Oh, right here. Cool. That was my issue. Just because I was messing with it today. Cool. So now you're seeing that it says hello world from Will. Cool. Now, if I were to take their parent element out, this is going to cause an issue, right? Because that does not, JSX expressions can only have one element, right? In this case, we had a div. Now there is another one that we could have. It's just called a fragment, just called a JSX fragment, that you can do this. If you, let's say you didn't want to have a div, this will also work. Right now, if I pull up my code, it can work there. So I just wanted to introduce JSX fragments. You can keep it as a div. That is super fine. It's not going to change anything. But just so you know, if you're like, oh man, I really don't want a div here, this is called a JSX fragment. And that will allow you to just still have your parent element and then your children within there. Any questions on the parent element? And there can only be one. So I can't have like a div here either. It says like, you know, H1, hello world. I can't have that. It can only have one parent element. So no siblings.
By default, does it automatically center align in the page, or is that fragment is what's doing that?
That's because I believe by default, because right here, yeah, so now it doesn't have it.
Okay, so I just did a refresh.
It was when I had the class name was app.
Right.
Yeah, when I had my div and the class name of app, I believe it's got text align center.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I was just coming from the CSS. Cool. Any other questions on the fragment? I can go back to div. Class name equals app. Perfect. And then now if I come back, now it's back in the center. Cool. Now this is awesome and this is great, but what if we wanted to build something else? So now we need to build our own components, right? Our own ability to create things. We want to create different components, different things that our application is going to need. What we're going to do is we're going to go into our source folder Within our source folder, we're actually going to create a folder called components. Now it does need to be lowercase and it does need to be plural. So if you just put, oh, then not like that. If you just put components, it's not going to work. Component. This is a keyword to say, okay, when JavaScript and React is looking for your components, when we actually, have one, then what will happen is if it doesn't have this keyword of components, just like this, and they'll say, oh, that doesn't exist. That doesn't, I'm having a trouble finding where all of our components live. And this is going to be where all of our components live. So anything that we create is going to live within this components folder. Now, I'm going to just create a component. And there's a couple things that you have to do. You have to have it as capital. So I'm going to call this component. I'm going to call this first component. Now I could do .js and that is just fine. But one thing to note is if you have the emit extension on VS Code, well, if you do JSX, you automatically see this sort of React come up right here. If you don't, I think mine's actually a plugin, so you might not see that. But by having a JSX, what it now allows is for me, if I wanted to do, if I wanted to write some sort of HTML and now has all those kind of plugins to auto close my stuff and to kind of do my little shortcuts for HTML. So I always like to do JSX. You can actually change this if you wanted to JSX. It's not going to matter. It doesn't do anything. Also wanted to note the reason we use, the reason it just does function here is because some of the old documentation still doesn't have it updated as arrow functions. Because I was sort of wondering, why does, if we use arrow functions, why is this starting here? And it's just to be in sync with all the documentation. So that's why that is the old function style. But we have our first component. Now there's going to be a couple things that we can do. And if you installed that ES7, there's a really great quick trip, as you can say RAFCE. And this is going to be a quick little way to create a React arrow function component. Cool. Now you don't have to do that. You can just do it this way and this will work exactly the same. But there's a few things and I want to break down exactly what's happening here. So here we've got this import React from React. Now, I don't believe you actually still need that. I think it's sort of it's similar to how a semicolon operates. If you don't have this, it's still going to work, but by default, it will automatically bring this in if you use RAFCE. I'll put that in chat as well. But you don't have to use that. That's just sort of the faster way to do it. Then we are creating our first arrow, right? And note that the component name needs to be the same thing as our function name. So here, first component needs to be exactly the same as what we have in our .jsx or in our components folder. So these are the exact same. We have our arrow function. We are returning something. Here we've got our, we're just returning first component. So I'm going to say in my first component, exclamation point, because this is fun. We end our function. And then this is really important. We have to make sure we export default first component. Now what this is doing is saying, okay, I want to export and I want other areas within my code to be able to utilize this code, to be able to call in this component and use it. Again, the idea behind components is we can actually pick it up and put it anywhere we want within our code. That's the power behind it. So I've got this, I've created my first component. Now let's actually see what happens. So here I'm within my component, right? Here I'm within my app.js. Sorry, not my component, my app.js. Let me clean this up a little bit. Then if I wanted to, I can actually just call my first component. And a couple things happen here. This is a self-closing tag. So all you do is, let's say I wanted, and what I am visualizing is it's going to have hello world, hello from Will, and then I'm actually injecting my first component to be able to be rendered. In order for me to do that, I've got to say import my component name from dot components first component. So what that's saying is, hey, from, and then it goes here, dot is saying this current level, there's going to be a folder called components. So dot means same level as my app, right? Which these are on the same level within my source folder. There's gonna be a folder called components. Within that, there is a file called first component. You don't have to put .jsx, it automatically knows. So then what that allows me to do is call that in and inject it immediately onto my app. So if I come here, you can see in my first component, it is taking the values from right here. We exported this, which allows my app.js to import it, created it, made it available. And then we said, this is exactly where I want it. If I were to move it, it'll just move it. And now I can start really messing and adding in different components and different things. Okay, we just did a lot. How are we feeling? Any questions on this? You guys give me a 1 in the chat if this is all peachy and we're crushing it. Cool. So somebody asked, in JavaScript, do you always need to export one file in order? Not necessarily always, but with this, when we're dealing with components, yeah, we want to be able to export it so that way people can have, or sorry, not people, sorry. That way our website can have access to these components. Somebody asked, what was the abbreviation? It is RAFCE. Find out what it means to me. Cool. Now, let's go even further. Let's create another component. You know, we're creative, so we're just going to call second component. Oh, I almost made an error. .jsx. And I'm going to say RAFCE. Second component in my second component. Whoa. This is magic. In all actuality, this should probably be in a something like a p tag. Instead of just having that, but for the sake of showing, that's okay. Cool. So I've got my second component. Now what's cool about it though, is I can do the same thing as I did with my app with my first component. I can actually do the same thing with these two right here. So in this, what I can do is I can say, oh, I should be, well, this is magic. Should change this. And then what I can do is I can say second component. I import into my first component, my second component. And now my first component breaks down to where it says in my first component. And then right under that, it says in my second component, whoa, this is magic. Now, because my first component brought in my second, packaged it up, and this is calling my first component, we should see in my first component, in my second component, whoa, this is magic. Any thoughts, any questions there? I don't have to call second component here. because my first component already does that for me. It's already part of my first component package, right? When we are getting this first component, it says, wait, first, let me go get my second component values. Okay, now I'm complete. Then it goes to my app.js. It looks a lot like this. Let me draw this. Here I've got my, I'm gonna say, do this. I'm gonna do this. Is I've got my app.js. Oops. And I'm gonna say my first component, and then my second component. Perfect. And I'm taking my values. So this is going to be an important concept. I'm taking my values in my second component and I'm passing it up to my first component. My first component renders that, has that value, said, okay, this is now part of me, right? The second component. And then when my app.js calls this first component, it says, okay, great. I can then show all of this material. Are there any questions on sort of how that works? Any thoughts here?
Tons of thoughts.
Tons of
So
thoughts.
basically, this is kind of like, this is the very basic of the Lego. Like this
Yes.
is one Lego stacks on top of the other, like stacks on top of the other one. So when we're using a functional app, depending upon, I'm guessing whatever variables say either true or false, it could then say use a Boolean statement or an if statement and then render different components based upon whatever selection it was, I'm assuming.
100%. That's really at the exactly. Great job, Robert. At the end of the day, that's really what we're doing is we are going to have these setups of, okay, here's my login page. So it's got these different components, right? And then if it's their first time, then okay, let's swap out or let's go ahead and show our login. And now that they've logged in, let's take that out. And then let's put in all the components that make up my dashboard. And when they click something else, we'll take those components. So based off the conditions, based off the nature of how my user is using this, I'm just swapping out components. And sometimes they, you know, I want components combined, and sometimes I don't. So for example, what I could also do is this, right? Let's say I have my second component, I've created it, I have my first component, but I realize actually I don't want this piece. I just wanted this in my second component. Well, this is magic. Well, up here, all I do is not have my first component. Instead, I just say second component. Brings that in. And now all it brings in is my second component. Now my first component is bound in this, just in this example, because it automatically brings in. So really, right, you're not going to have the first without the second, but the second is standalone. If I had something unique that it did, and I don't want it to be with my first component, I can just call it here. And I don't even need the other first component piece. So that's really just interchanging and switching to whatever fits your needs. And that's the power behind component development.
I just want to address a couple of questions. So I know one was that, well, why don't you just import the whole components folder? It doesn't work that way. In React. You actually have to, because they're all different files, they're all different, because a component is just a function. So if you want the app to have access to that, you have to be really specific and say, hey, in this components folder, I want this particular function to be ran on this particular page. So JavaScript won't know which one that you want the function to run. So hopefully that I addressed that question. And then the next question was, this is when we start to modularize, we're not there yet. You will start to see why we don't do all the apps, all the components in one. when you get into like your URLs and hey, I want this nav bar to display on this particular page versus this page, or I want my list to display on this. That's where all that's going to come into play. So depending on the app that you're building, we're going to start modularizing, not yet, but when we start to do it, it will start to make sense. Like, oh, that's why you need to do that. Will is just going over the absolute basics to kind of get the concept. And then once everyone got it, then we'll start going a little bit more like, hey, well, when you start building this app, this would be the best practice to do. So hopefully let me know if I addressed your questions. If not, put it in chat.
Yeah, here's my favorite example I like to use. Because in a lot of spaces, right, you'll see like just not necessarily for this, but just in development, right? Like if you I know I always use Python a lot. This is what I've written a lot in. So if you don't know Python, I'm so sorry that I keep using that as an example. But sometimes you can import everything. And so you have access to everything. And there's some power to that, if you will, like you have access to everything. But here's my sort of example in my imports and being selective with our imports. There are different types of hikes out there. There's hikes in like Australia. There's hikes here in Washington. There's there's hiking on ice mountains. There's like sand dune hiking, right? There's tons of different hiking. Now, in theory, you could have a backpack that had everything. If you were, it had ice picks if you needed, it had sunscreen, it had water, it had swim trunks, it had a snow jacket. You could, in theory, have a pack that had everything with you. But that wouldn't be very efficient. If you're hiking in the Sahara Desert, you probably don't need snow gear. You probably don't need, like if you're playing in sand dunes, you probably don't need ice picks, right? You could take them with you, sure, but it might actually just slow you down. In the same vein, if you're hiking on Mount Everest, you probably don't need a swimsuit, right? You'll probably die if you do that. And so the same thing is when we're dealing with imports, we want to make sure that our hiking backpack is only for the things that we need. If I'm going to climb Mount Everest, I only want my snow gear and my ice picks and my ropes. If I'm going to play with sand dunes, I don't want my ice picks and whatever you do to play in sand dunes. Or I'm going to go into Washington, I need a raincoat. And so by selecting these imports or your hiking backpack, it makes you more efficient because you're not bringing all these things that you actually don't really need. You just bring what you need, and it actually does help your code run faster because when you're importing so many things, this is just more generic, not necessarily for components. If you're importing everything, sure, you have access to it, but if you're not utilizing it, then it actually can slow you down because you're bringing those imports with you everywhere you go. Does that make sense? But yes, if you do have multiple components, then so like let's say I did want to bring in, let's say I wanted to bring in, let's try it. If I wanted to bring in my second component and my first component. Oops. Cool. Now let's see what happens. From here, it says second component, still brings in my first component. That includes my second component. And then it still shows my hello world and from Will. So unfortunately, anytime you do bring in multiple components, you do have to import, because what would be nice is if you could put like a comma and say, these are the imports or these are components I want from this folder, but it doesn't work because you give the direct pathway right here. Any questions on this so far?
Ones and zeros in the chat, and if that was cleared up.
Hey, yo, can you hear me?
Yeah, of course. Hey, Alex.
What's up? So I'm pretty sure TA Gray already answered this question. I just want to make sure. But if you put a component inside of the first one and you're importing the first one, let's say you have 3 or 4 components in the first one, you only need to import the first one. You don't need to import the other ones unless you're directly putting them in there, right?
Correct. So let's say I had a third component. Let's go ahead and make that. .jsx. Cool, this has this is the third component for chilling. Let's say I wanted, so. This is my, and it doesn't matter, it's not in a P tag, we're just trying to show. I wanted to say this. Third component. My first component handles the imports for me.
Mhm.
And then on this side, let's see, I got rid of this. I only need to import my first component. I'll get rid of this. I only need to import this because when I run this, what's happening is when I'm rendering this and I'm saying, okay, this is what I want to show this, and React says, okay, great. It goes in, it says, all right, we have our parent, we're good to go. Okay, we have an H1. Okay, first component. This is a function. At the end of the day, this is a function, right? This whole thing is just a function. And so we know that in our code, when it's going from top to bottom, what it does is the function could be declared 1 million lines ahead of that, but it stops what it's doing and it goes and it runs that function, right?
Yeah.
And so what's happening here is when we get this is our function call. It goes, okay, great. First, before I see this H1, I need to go run this function. So it runs over here. Says, okay, great. This function, cool. I have a P tag. Second component. This is our function call. It runs into the second component, runs this, gets its information. We return that. This is what's being returned. So it says, cool, I have the value. It puts that value here for us. Then it gets to this line, says, another function. It runs over to third, comes, gets this value because that's what's being returned to us, puts it here. Then it runs back to our app.js and says, cool, I'm done running. Here's everything that I have. I've got my P tag. I have my return statement, what was being returned from this component. And then I've got my return from this component. And it says, cool, you are good to go. It shows everything, shows all three. And then it runs my other H1 that says from well. Did that answer
Okay,
your
so
question?
basically you're importing the other components into that first component, and then into the app, you're going to import the whole thing, which is all in the first component.
Yeah, so what's important to think through here is I'm importing here and I'm running the function and it's giving me a value. So
Mhm.
what's being returned here, what that becomes, remember how like whenever we had, I think I made one of these. If I've got a function, oh my gosh, I can never spell function. Some function that says do something. And then I say return 5, right? That's all my function does. And then I say let X equal some function. And then I console.log X, right? What's
Mhm.
happening is here, I've got a function. The code says, okay, great. Oh, I spelled that wrong. My bad. It says, okay, great. I'm going to not do anything yet because the function hasn't been called. Then I get down here. I'm creating this variable called X and it's equal to this function. And anytime we set a variable or some value equal to the function, it's always what the function returns, right? If it didn't return anything, this is going to give me undefined. But because we return 5, now if I console log X, it's going to give me the value of 5.
Right.
Our function call becomes what we return. So that being said, here in our first component, we're importing it. Cool. We're doing our function call. And this really becomes, what just happened?
Becomes the value of that component.
Yeah, it becomes, I hate this. Comes this, right? That's what's being returned.
Yeah.
So this is what is now taking place of second component. This is what second component creates and becomes, is this div. And then it does the same thing with third. So then when it gets at the end of this first component, what it's returning is this P tag. It's returning this div right here. And then it's returning the other div from my third component.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. That's what I'm here for. Any other questions on this? All we have is props after this. So this is really the meat of creating this. And then we are just going to pass in some props.
Can you have multiple functions in a component?
No. Okay. Cannot.
Well, I wrote it down in chat, but just to clarify,
Mhm.
on that app.js,
Mhm.
if you wanted third component, you would actually have to import third component, or could you import first component and then just write third component on 11?
Nope, great question. No, you would, again, just because of what we just talked about.
Okay.
Remember that whenever this runs, although it's imported, what's being returned is this. And so the actual component, the function itself would have to be imported to just get that value, because from app.js's perspective, it doesn't even know that first component is doing all of this stuff, because it's saying, hey, first component, give me what you got. First component does all the work, it creates these divs, calls these functions, goes back in the back of the room, the back office, does what it does, and comes back and says, okay, cool, I have a p tag, I've got a div with a p tag, and then I've got another div. And then app.js says, okay, dope, I'll go ahead and show that right here. So yeah, if you wanted to have third component, you just would import the third component.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions before I move on? So somebody asked, so are components kind of like their own divs? They can be, they don't have to be. So similar to how we talked about earlier, they can be fragments, they can be sort of anything that you need. If you just wanted to have an unordered list, and that was your parent, you could do that as well. So they can be anything. In this case, just at the beginning, they start as divs, but they can be anything as long as there's a parent element and not any sort of siblings. Somebody asked if we can start in this class sort of building, and we're going to build something and then having an end product. That's exactly what we'll do, right? It really this week and this next week are kind of just to get the basics here. But yes, we'll start building projects. And then when we get to weeks 5 and 6, what we're going to do is build an entire week 5 and 6 is us building a full stack application, utilizing our database, utilizing everything that we know to make sure you guys are prepared for the exam. I will be honest, I am like the Bernie Sanders of exam stuff. I love to give anything that you need. I will do that. I will set you up as much as I can. But I love that idea. Yes, I love building things. And yeah, sometimes these concepts are harder to do if you're not really trying to accomplish anything. So I'll try to integrate that and maybe have a goal for next class. But yeah, that's a great idea. We will we'll start trying to build some stuff to maybe have an end goal. Maybe I can show you, here's what we're going to have and here's how we're going to build it. So thanks for that. Cool. Now,
That
go
was
ahead.
one more question. So each component will only contain one function. Yes, they're supposed to. Just for right now, I don't want you guys getting confused. So yes,
Yeah.
for best practice, one component, one.
Mhm.
Is yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Greg. I don't know what is happening right now. Okay, cool. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is props, right? Because that is your assignment. You've got to do prop it up. And so obviously I want to always make sure that I am preparing you for your assignments. Now, props is, well, first off, before I talk about props, one thing I want to talk about is I'm going to bring this back up again. And we're going to come here, here. Oh, let's do this. Sorry. Here we go. There we go. And then I'm going to draw 2 more. Cool. So this right here is my app.js. Here's my first component. Here's my second component. I'm just gonna put second C, and then here's my third component. Let's see. Cool. Now, if we notice here, my first component is bringing in my second and my third component, right? One thing to note is that in React, this is where props comes in, is Java. It's Java. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. Data can only stream downward. And what I mean by that is, in order for when we're wanting to deal with some sort of data, if I want to fill out a form and I want the information from the user, the data comes it can only go downward. It can't go upward. It goes downstream. And so it must come, in this case, from my app.js to my first component. Then if my third component needs access, it must come from my first component to my third component. Or if my second component needs access to whatever data that is, comes here. I cannot push data, and we'll see an example in a second, from second to first component. It can only stream downward. By downward, I mean right now our app.js is our parent component, right? It's the one that holds first component. Then first component holds and this is just in this current structure. We'll talk about it here in a second. Our first component holds second and third, meaning that they are children of the first component. Now, obviously, if I were to call third component in my app.js, then we would also have it here, right? If it had direct access to my app.js, it would come up here. So one thing to note is data can only go downward, it cannot go upward. It'll be easier when actually we start dealing with data right now. Let me clear this. So anytime I'm dealing with data, anytime I'm wanting to do that, there's this thing called props, right? And so if I want to have, let's say I wanted this to have in my first component, we're chilling there. And instead of this saying from Will, let's get rid of this. And I wanted that in my first component, right? I wanted my first component to say from Will. But like we talked about, the power of components is that we can change the data in and out. And if I hard coded this will not necessarily make sense, right? I'll have to do that if Gray wants to do something, or Robert, or Oscar, or Jennifer, right? Like I'd have to have a ton of different H1s, do some sort of condition. That's where props comes in. Props is properties. And what this allows, is for me to pass in some sort of data that my first component will have access to. In this case, I want it to be a name. Now, please note that props are passed in as an object. Props are passed in as an object. So if I were to console log props, console.log props, if I were to do that, I think already, let me undo this, and it will automatically should show this if I inspect. Oops, sorry. Here you can see that I have this object that's being passed in. It doesn't have any values because I haven't done anything, but you can see first component.jsx7 is my props being passed in. Now, in React, what you'll see is there's going to be two, and that's because we have that strict mode on in our index.js, I believe. In this, in this guy, because we have strict mode, that's what gives you the double console log. So if that's why you're like, why is it doing it twice? That's fine. That's just coming from strict mode. But I can pass in values to my first component via props. And what it'll give me is an object. Now, how do I pass in values? What we'll do is here, I can actually create, and remember, an object is a key value pair. So what I can do is I can actually create those values. So I can say first name equals Will. Now, yes, we are hard coding now, and this is really to help you get the topic right. We're gonna create it to where it's not having to be hard coded, but this is just so you guys understand how props work. Because you might be like, well, why aren't we just hard coding if we're hard coding here? This is just really for the sake of understanding how it works. But here I've got first name equals Will. And then if I come here and I see my props, my console log props, now what's being passed through is this object of Will. So if I were to come back, what I can do then is I can say, I can destructure Or I could say, well, actually, let's just do this. I could destructure it. So I could say const name, but we don't have an age, right? Equals props. And destructuring at this top piece is very popular. And then what I can do is just say from curly bracket name. And so what's going to happen here is it says from Will. Why did that not come through? Ain't this? Nope.
Name and first name.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, no. Here, maybe instead of destructuring, let's do this for the sake of not confusing. Now that I've got this, because I know that this is a first name. Let's see. There we go. Okay, let's backtrack. Here I passed in this variable, if you will, but this is just our value. This is our key name, its first name, and its value is Will. Then what happens is I'm passing it in, and because I have props here, that is basically saying this function is accepting some sort of object, right? And this is a very common thing. Like you most often will see that it says props. But like most components are going to bring in props because you're constantly passing data. Well, because it's an object, I know that I can use dot notation, right? To grab that specific value. We saw that if I console logged this, it's giving me Will with the key of first name. Yes, thank you. That was the issue. I called it first name and I put name. And so now what I can do is I can pass in that information. So if I wanted to, and remembering that data flows downward, if I wanted my third component to have access to this and say, you know, p tag, whoa, his name is Will, or sorry, I wanted to say his name is whatever it is. Then what I can do is, because it flows downward, I have this value of props. I can say first name equals props dot first name. But because it is a value, do this. And so now, if I have my third component, except props, cool. Now I can say props dot first name. First name. I save this. It says, whoa, his name is Will from Will. So I'm able to pass data from my app.js into my first component. I can do whatever I want with it. And if I want to pass it to any child components, I can by just doing the same thing. By replicating. And if I wanted to change this name, like changed, that's fine. These can be anything. But just in my third component, I'll have to say props.changed. And now if I come back, it says, whoa, his name is Will. So that can be unicorn, it could be cupcake, it could be anything you want it to be. But this is how I can pass data from my app down to my first component. And my first component, I can pass it down to my third component if I wanted. I can do a whole, you know, I can, if I had 100 different components based on it, I could pass data all the way down through that way. Obviously, you can't pass data from your third component to your first component to your app because data flows downward from the parent to its child. And if that child has children, then it goes down to them. I could do this in the second component. I could do the same thing. I could pass props that I don't necessarily utilize as well. Like if this was a huge dictionary and I just needed a few things, that's where the destructuring will come out of. Are there any questions on this? We're exactly at the hour. This is all I had to go over. Because this is everything now should be, you should be able to complete your assignments with everything. Are there any questions on props, how props work? What we're doing with props, anything like that?
So, if you wanted to create a prop, obviously you said it starts from the top and it can only go down, but does it need to stop at the very top? Or can I start it at like second component if I wanted to?
Yeah, you could start it here. So let's say that we didn't even have, well, it depends, right? So like, let's say I had this. I didn't even pull in that props. Let's say I just had gray. Right? If I wanted to create that because my parent of the third is first, now you should see it says, whoa, his name is Gray. And I didn't even pass it. I didn't have to pass that from my app. So yeah, you can pass it from any parent to any child. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't, not all the data has to start at app.js. It just has to start at a parent to a child was more of what I was trying to create. But thanks for the clarification.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Because first component is a parent of third, meaning that it brings in third, then you can actually just create a prop right here and pass in whatever information you need. Great question. Thanks for clarifying that. Any other questions? That's all I have for tonight. So. You guys put a 1 in the chat if this is making sense. I know that it's the end of the first week. It probably feels like a lot. And if you haven't gotten started, because I understand life and you're a weekend warrior, I believe in you, you can do it. But also give yourself some grace because this is new, this is new, new stuff for everybody. So I'm going to go through the chat real quick. Cool. Lots of ones. Cool. Seeing if I missed anything. Cool. So somebody asked, so this is essentially the whole body in HTML. Yeah. We are swapping out our HTML and our elements in our app.js based off of whatever we need. We're just swapping things in and out. That is sort of a little bit later on in the course, but yeah, it's exactly what we're doing.
So can you only have that one div then, or is that div technically like everything has to stay within that div?
Yeah, so you can only have one parent element. Remember if we try to do something like div, it's going to break everything. Yeah, you can only have one parent element in your app.js or in your function.
And so like how in HTML you can name divs different things. Do you have to name a div in here?
Nope, you can create, I mean, if you guys didn't know, you can create your own elements and tags, but yes, you could do that exact thing. You can create anything you needed. If again, showing that you could do in the same way that you could just do a fragment. That also works. So yeah, it can be anything you wanted, as long as it has a parent. If I said will. Still works. Oh, will is not defined. This shows in the back end. Very confusing. Maybe it does just have to be a HTML element. If I did. So I really want to test something right now. Okay. Yeah, so you cannot just create anything. I was thinking from the component side, I assumed you could, but it seems like it does need to be a legit HTML element. I usually just use div or a fragment anyway.
Yeah, so I guess like, so as you go down the road, you wouldn't just name it like first component, you name it like a nav bar or something like that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so we'll have like form, we'll have nav bar, you would have comment, you would have profile. Yeah, you would have stuff like that. Like user info component. And so anytime you wanted to swap that in and out. And like I said, if you had, let's say you had user info and it was, it had a whole bunch of information that you could have access to and you need to pass that to another component, you don't have to use every prop that you have. So even if I, like right here, I have first name, Will, and then I have, last name equals Calhoun. I don't have to use that. I'm just passing it through as props. Props will have that. So if I check this, what is happening?
You need to quotes.
Oh yeah, thank you. Cool. So though it's not showing it, if I were to inspect, I look at my object, I do have those. I have access to that in my props. I'm just not utilize those. So somebody asked if we could use Bootstrap. You can. I'm happy to do that. Actually, next Tuesday, we can kind of look at Bootstrap. I love Bootstrap. I'm a huge fan of Bootstrap. There's also Gray just put in an introduction for that. And then Gray's Hour will start next week. So they'll start next week, week 2 on Thursdays. The office hour will be Gray's Hour and they will walk through anything that you guys need. So please make sure, as always, if you have something you want to learn, to let Gray know, and then they can build that. So any other questions before I stop the recording?
I noticed sometimes in your return statements, you don't have the semicolon. Sometimes you do. Is that just doesn't matter, or is it?
Yeah, JavaScript will actually interpret it if you don't have it, which is
Okay.
dope. So
Because I know Java will not. It will
yeah,
just
no,
drop it to
Java
you.
will break everything. But JavaScript will already interpret it, so you don't have to.
Cool.
Yeah, right here versus here, and they work the same. But if I were to add it, it's not going to change anything.
So it's a little
JavaScript.
more forgiving. Kind of like
Yeah,
Python.
JavaScript is cool like that. Yeah, very forgiving compared to a Java.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? Great question. All right, friends. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.